Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. This is our first webinar for the Fall 2020 webinar series. In today's webinar, the Most Reverend John P. Dolan and Deacon Ed Shoener will share how we can support those who have been affected by suicide. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. I would like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions may be sent to our presenters using the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel, and I will read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenters today. Most Reverend John P. Dolan is Auxiliary Bishop of San Diego. He also serves the diocese as Vicar General, Moderator of the Curia, and Vicar for Clergy. He is the chaplain of the Lost Boys of Sudan, a member of the Catholic Institute for Mental Health Ministry, and a board member of Father Joe's Villages, a ministry to the homeless. Ed Shoener was ordained a permanent deacon in 2004 and serves at St. Peter's Cathedral in the Diocese of Scranton. He co-founded the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers and the Katie Foundation after his daughter Katie died by suicide in 2016. Bishop and Deacon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter, Deacon, so that we can see your PowerPoint, see your screen. Okay, wonderful. I'll let you two take it away.
Thank you, Erin.
You're welcome.
So I think it's fair to say neither Bishop or I would rather not be so well versed in this topic, but because of the circumstances in our lives, we are. And we joined with a lot of other Catholic leaders to pull this book together because there's a real need for this. Suicide is a common way to die in the United States, and the church needs to be there in the midst of this. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint going here. Help me out here, Erin.
Go ahead and click on the screen. There you go.
So as I said, suicide is a common way to die. That's one of the reasons we wanted to write this book with the help of so many other Catholic leaders. In the United States, and this number is from 2018, over 48,000 people died from suicide. That's a lot of people. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the country. And I suspect in 2020, because of the pandemic and some of the other the mental health challenges that go along with that, we're probably going to be over 50,000 in 2020 in suicide deaths per year. We hear a lot about youth suicide, and that is a problem. You see the statistic here, people between the ages of 10 and 34, over 15,000 people die per year from suicide in that age group. And you know, pray for those, to make it in a more personal way, pray for those who will die today from suicide. If today's an average day in the United States, about 130 people are going to die from suicide today. It's a very sad statistic, but it's not simply a statistic. It is real people who are loved and cared for and are going to be sorely missed because of their death that they will go through today. So it is a fierce suffering that cries out for the presence of Christ, his church, and his ministers, which are many of you here joining us today. Christ wants to be in the midst of this suffering that comes after a suicide death. I liken it often to going into the tomb, to bringing the light of Christ into the tomb. It can be very dark, it can be very difficult, it can be very challenging, but it's where Christ wants us to be. It's an anguishing and persistent cause of death. You hear quite often that suicides have increased in the last few years, and that's true. Suicide rates go up and down, and compared to what it was in the 80s and 90s, suicide is higher. But I'll just bring you this quote here from Dr. Matthew Knock, who studies, a psychologist who has an institute that studies suicide at Harvard. And I'll read it to you there. In 2014, the suicide rate was 13 per 100,000 people. And in 1914, the rate was 16 per 100,000 people. So for the past 100 years, despite treatments and research efforts, the suicide rate remains extremely high. In other words, suicide's gone up and down over the last 100 years, but we really haven't made a whole lot of progress. It seemed like we were in the 80s and 90s when the suicide rates started to drop, but then they started to pick back up again in the United States. And just after the recent highly publicized suicides of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, if you remember, those two good people died within a couple of days of each other, and it created a real public discussion about suicide. And there were some editorials and opinion pieces throughout the media. And at that time, this doctor here, Dr. Richard Friedman from Cornell, wrote, and I think it's a very good statement, that he said, we've seen the rates of death from heart disease and HIV plummet over time, but not so for suicide. The simple reason suicide's been neglected for so long is stigma. We should declare war on suicide just as we've done with other public health threats like HIV and heart disease, and give it the research and clinical funding needed to beat it. And that's the key word, that stigma, that sort of revolves around suicide and mental health and mental illness and mental health challenges, all of those things. There's just a stigma where we are reluctant to talk about this for a whole host of reasons, which we get into in the book and we'll touch on a little bit during this presentation. But if there's one thing that we need to get away from in this country and within the church, is stigma about talking about suicide and mental health. That needs to change. So let me just show you briefly a little bit of the statistics on suicide and the age groups. And we hear a lot about suicide and for young people, and across the top is the ages. You see age 10 to 14, 15 to 24, and so on. And along the side column in the blue is the rank, where it ranks in the cause of death for those age groups. And for the younger age groups, up to age 34, it is the second highest type of death. I mean, fortunately for young people, they don't die at a very high rate to begin with, but it's still the second highest rate. And as you see, it starts to pick up, particularly in the late teens and early 20s. And there's no coincidence there, because that's oftentimes when mental illnesses first start to evidence themselves. 436 for the extremely young is still way too high, but it is a lower number. And as you can see, as we move on through middle age, suicides continue to remain high, and 7,000, 8,000 in your 50s, and then it continues to be high in the 50s and 60s. And I put the number down at the bottom, even for people over 65. Even though other causes of death, drop suicide from the top 10 for that age group, there's still 8,200 people, over 8,000 people who die from suicide even in their elder years. So it continues to be a problem. I would say it's as you can just see by the plain numbers, the number of suicides for adults is a significant problem, and it's something we need to pay more attention to. Suicide rates by age and also by gender, female and male. The basic statistic is that women attempt suicide more often than men, but men are more likely to complete the suicide. That's usually because men use more lethal means, i.e. a gun, to complete the suicide. So you can see these rates here. The light blue is the women, the dark blue is the men. The numbers are the number of suicides per 100,000. And in the United States, the average now is around 16 per 100,000. So you can see that the men, suicides by men are well above the average, and women are slightly below. But I think this is important to remember that when you're ministering to people with suicide, that there is a gender difference, but it is quite high. and particularly as you get older, the suicide rate can be high. So it continues throughout life. So our book was written primarily because people who have lost someone to suicide are all too often reluctant to talk to church leaders about suicide. And we've given some thought to that and tried to understand that and tried to address some of these concerns so that those of us and those of you that are church leaders are aware of these and can do something to try to overcome these. So one of the three reasons came up with is one, a doubt that clergy and other church leaders understand their experience of suicide, that they understand what it's like to die and to have a loved one die from suicide. You very seldom hear clergy talk about it, and I'll get into this in a minute. You very seldom hear it talked about in a homily or something like that. So there's this doubt that the clergy, it's never talked about, and there's a doubt that the church leaders understand their experience. Now, there are some very good priests and other leaders that are very compassionate and understanding, but so many of us that are church leaders are reluctant to talk about this. The fear that the church teaches that their loved one is probably in hell. This goes back many years, if not many centuries, in the teachings of the church. And Bishop Dolan will get into this in more detail later on in this presentation. But there is this long-standing teaching that suicide is a mortal sin, and if you die with a mortal sin at the point of death, that it puts your soul into jeopardy, I guess would be the way to put it. And so people don't like to talk about it because they particularly the church leaders, that out of the fear that they're going to just make a moral judgment and say that they're probably in hell. And then the third disheartening concern is that people know where to find support in the Catholic Church. They are not sure if there's ministries that are available to support people that are grieving a suicide and also to help people that live with a mental illness. They just don't know where to go in the church. So our book tried to get in and does get into each of these three concerns in a particular way and in more in depth. And we have some theologians from the church. We've consulted with psychologists who are good Catholic psychologists who understand these issues, and talk to people that are developing ministries throughout the church to address these needs. So the first one is the doubt that the clergy and other church leaders understand their concern, and how can we overcome this? So one is educating ourselves and correcting misunderstandings. I know when I was studying to be or formed to be a deacon, we had a brief period of time where we talked about psychology. To be honest, I don't know if I ever in my formation discussed in any detail the topic of suicide, and I don't believe it's discussed a whole lot in seminary. It may be touched on in seminary for priests, but it's not something that is extensively discussed. So those of us that are church leaders need to become more knowledgeable and understand what suicide is, where it comes from, why it happens. So part of it is simply educating ourselves and trying to get past so many of the misunderstandings and stigma that's out there. The other thing is that it's not, to make it clear, it is not a moral failing or a character flaw. It is so often rooted in some sort of mental illness or some sort of severe adverse experience, but it is not something that requires that kind of judgment, calling it a moral failing or a character flaw. Suicidal thoughts, more correctly, can be likened to chest pains. It's something you need to talk about. If you were having chest pains, you would immediately go and get some help. Similarly, if someone is having suicidal thoughts, you should go get help. And those of us that are in leadership positions should be able to talk about this and have people freely come to us if they are having suicidal thoughts, and encouraging them to get the kind of help that they need to deal with it. And grieving families need the assurance that the clergy and leaders will not be making moral judgments after their loved one died by suicide. That's the last thing those of us who have lost someone to suicide need is some sort of moral lecture being given about the suicide. What we need is compassion, empathy, caring, and That's what's needed and what the church needs to focus on. And in particular, at the funeral. You might remember a couple years ago, there was some publicity about a funeral in the Detroit area where the homily focused on the church teachings on suicide rather than on the hope of eternal life and the mercy of Christ. I would say in general, the funeral is not the time to talk about church teaching on suicide. The funeral is the time to talk about the love of Christ and the hope that the family can find in the mercy of Christ after their loved one's passing, and maybe just touch upon the suicide a little bit. But the better time to talk about suicide is throughout the normal course of parish life. Would be a better time to talk about it, maybe in an occasional homily and the prayers of the faithful, things like that, to prepare the parish community so that when a suicide does occur, the parish community is in a position to be able to help those people that have lost someone. One of the things that I learned early on, shortly after Katie died, I was on the Gus Lloyd radio show. Some of you might be aware of this, and I was using this term, Katie committed suicide. And it was pointed out to me, and I since have learned by talking to mental health and suicide specialists that is not a good word to use. And I have, fortunately, over the last couple of years, gotten out of the habit of using it. But don't use the word committed suicide. It's loaded with judgment, and we should try to stop using it. We need to stop using it. We instead use phrases like the person died by suicide, they took their own life, and to shift how we talk about suicide from judgment to a healthier discussion about mental illness. People commit crimes, they commit sins, but they don't commit cancer, for example. They don't commit heart attacks. They die from cancer, they die from heart attacks, they die from suicide. And to start to be able to understand that and encourage a healthier discussion when there is a suicide, encourage a healthier discussion about why it happened, what are the type of treatments, how can we reduce the stigma in the community when that happens. So that's if you remember one thing out of this little talk today, try to get out of the habit of using the phrase committed suicide and use the phrase died by or took their own lives or something less judgmental phrase. So to move into the topic about talking about our own stories and the need for parish leaders and church leaders to talk about suicide in their families. My daughter Katie died when she was 29 years old in August of 2016. And to be honest with you, even though it's been 4 years, it's still hard for me to talk about it. And last thing I'm sure many of you want to see is a 60-something guy tearing up in front of you. So I've had the fortune, after Katie died, her friends and family here in the Scranton area started the Katie Foundation. We have an annual walk called the 5 Kate to bring awareness in our community about mental health. And our local healthcare system, the Geisinger healthcare system, did a story on Katie and a video, which I'll show now, which gives you some good background on Katie and what happened. And also, I think a good example of how we can try to overcome the stigma of mental illness and suicide in our communities and ultimately in the church. So let me see if this video will work here, which I have no reason to think it won't. Katie growing up was a beautiful, wonderful, vibrant little girl almost from the get-go. She was born on Halloween. So Halloween in our house here was always a big day. She was just a wonderful, sweet girl, the best kid you could hope to want to raise. Scranton High School is where she went. She was a salutatorian at Scranton High School. She was the freshman sensation on her soccer team, president of the National Honor Society. She was dating boys, and it was a wonderful time in her life, at least all outward appearances. Katie's first experience with the mental illness probably started before we as parents knew. This mental illness was causing all sorts of anxieties for her, and she was cutting on her arm, and she would cover it with her bracelets. This is when she was a senior in high school. We didn't know what to make of it because we had no experience in mental illness. The response when she came back to high school was just this silence. I don't think anybody was deliberately being mean or setting us aside. It's just that our friends and family and other people at the school don't know what to say.
It took us a long time to begin to understand what this mental illness is, what bipolar disorder is. We had never heard of it. She always took her medicine. She always took it seriously. It was a lot of hit or miss with these medicines, but she stuck in there for a long time. But finally, at the end, the last year, nothing was working. They were just throwing the medicine cabinet at her. She just became so terribly, terribly, painfully depressed, and she tried to pull herself out of it. The depression just overwhelmed her. She died from suicide in August 3rd, 2016. So I thought it would be good just to simply say this is what happened. She had a mental illness and she died from suicide, but to recognize it as an illness, not as a character flaw or a moral failing or anything like that. It apparently spoke to what a lot of people with mental illness experience, and this obituary went viral. This is a unique medical school because no other medical school has made behavioral health, in collaboration with its community, its #1 priority. The Behavioral Health Initiative is a wonderful initiative that we at the Katie Foundation have been supporting because it brings the treatment of mental illness into the community. If you think about many of these issues and problems as being brain disorders, biologically based, strong genetic factors, then that's going to help remove the stigma that's been associated with having behavioral health problems, psychiatric problems. There's so many misconceptions about people that have a mental illness. Mental illness is an illness like all the other illnesses that doctors treat, and it needs to be understood that way. The goals of the curriculum would be provide the tools and the awareness and the expertise to help integrate behavioral health into the physical healthcare world so that it is seamless and it is just a matter of fact that those two problems will be addressed together. And that's what I like about the BHI, be integrating the care of people with a mental illness into the broader community in many, many different ways, and it's a great thing.
So that is a nice video about bringing mental health care out into the community, and our hope, Bishop and I's hope is that we can bring the same openness and day-to-day treatment of mental health care into our parish communities and the broader church. So I'll turn it over to you, Bishop, to talk about your experience of suicide, and then to also talk a bit about the church teaching on suicide.
Thank you, Deacon Ed. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you for really getting to know you. I came to know Deacon Ed here in San Diego. He lives in Scranton, but he finds his time over here in San Diego as a moment of pleasure, and he participates in, well, he's been the main contributor to the Catholic Institute for Mental Health at the University of San Diego, where I first had met him and came to admire his zeal for promoting this very important topic within the Catholic Church, within the Catholic enterprise. And I came to connect with him partly because of my interest in it through my own life. I had experienced suicide through suicide loss through in my family. And this began when I was a youngster. I was just, my brother Tom had committed suicide, had died by suicide when he was, when I was just going into 8th grade. In fact, his funeral was on the first day of school at St. Mary Magdalene Parish. We didn't know much about the concept of suicide. That was the first experience I had ever had with suicide in my life, and it happened to be a family member. So it was very tragic, obviously, for us. And, you know, coming to this reality, there were a lot of people who offered great support. In fact, that whole church was packed with people, including my classmates and friends of Tom. And there was a great deal of support for my parents. My folks had 9 children, and Tom was one of them. And wonderful guy, wonderful young man. He died at the age of 19. His case was unusual in that he started to show he was going off track with some drugs, and he connected with a friend of his, and on a high, they decided to do something really stupid, and they went on a binge of robbing places, which put Tom in prison. He was imprisoned at Chino State, and he was remorseful. When we went up to see him there at Chino, again, he was around 19 years old. The whole family packed up and went up there to see him. And he showed great remorse. He seemed to be improving. He looked healthy. He was connecting with a chaplain there, a Catholic priest. And all signs were he was on the road to recovery from any addiction that he had. And then within months, we were hearing some positive signs that he might be released, and then all of a sudden we get news from his lawyer that he had died by suicide. There in prison, he had hanged himself, and that moment obviously shook everybody. It shook my parents especially, no doubt. I recall very vividly the moment when my mom was leaning over the coffin where my brother was lying in state, and just trembling and touching him, and then she breaks down, and my dad was watching my mom, and my dad, who was the anchor of the family, broke down as well, which caused this ripple effect in the whole family. All of the siblings just broke down, and it was uncontrollable. And all that said, and we can recognize that my parents had great grief, and they still, you know, they're both 90 years old, and if they would give anything, if Tom would still be with us. And you hear people say, oh, this must have been terrible for your parents. All that said is true. But it was also terrible for me as a 13-year-old boy who was going through his coming of age years, which should have been the normal years for a young man boy to grow into young adulthood. And all of that was changed and overnight. And my sense was to try to fix this problem. As a 13-year-old boy, you lean toward various heroes in your life, and actually Tom was something of a hero for me. He was my older brother, and when I saw him starting to go downhill, and then when he lost his life through suicide, my attempt was to try to fix that and not to bring any more shame or hardship on my parents. So for a young boy, having to take that on his shoulders was really hard. And as a result, my life took on something of a different persona. I tried to be something better than Tom, not John, but something better than Tom. And so everything that Tom did, I did, and then tried to excel beyond that. And not surprisingly, although I didn't think of this, this wasn't a part of the fore of my mind, I found myself in the seminary, which fed this need to take on this different persona, something better than Tom, not John. I remember my father even telling me quite clearly on a number of occasions, John, just be yourself. But I wasn't quite ready for that. My goal was to be something of a savior for the family. And that became a, a real hardship for me as time went on. My sister Therese also ended her life. She was 27, 28 years old. She had married a man named Joe Gore, and he was about 10 years older. And Joe wasn't particularly, he didn't have any particular faith. Therese was a faithful person. She attended church, and he would actually allow, encourage her to go to church as well. And she was a teacher in a Catholic school. But we're not exactly sure. I'm not 100% sure why she ended her life through suicide. But there is a sense that maybe she was just holding all of this with the remorse of losing Tom herself. And there were some troubles within the marital life that caused her to go into depression. So there could have been a number of things, including mental disorder. One of the realities is that when my brother Tom had died in the 70s and my sister died in the early 80s, psychology and psychiatry were still kind of suspect, partly because we didn't have the technology that we have today where you can actually do, brain scanning for depression through MRIs and, look for the biomarkers, and all of those things that we have today at our fingertips, which really help us to see that a brain can, literally be broken. It can have holes in it, and it can have all of these little points that can stop a person from acting, rationally. And we see people fall into depression or have schizophrenic disorders or bipolar disorders, and all of these realities that we couldn't necessarily see in the 70s and the 80s. And so again, psychology and psychiatry, there was a lot of guesswork. There was a lot of data. It was data driven, but there was still a lot of guesswork. And today we're in a much better place. But all that said, when my sister Teresa died by suicide, she hanged herself as well. And the doctor told, or the police officer told Joe to inform the parents. Actually, they were going to inform my mom and dad, but Joe said no, he would do it. And instead, he took his own life. He died by suicide, by asphyxiation. So we were expecting them actually on Thanksgiving Day. And instead we found the police officer who shared the news that both had died. They were the last to arrive. We were expecting them to arrive for dinner, but that didn't happen. All that said, I still attempted to keep moving and try to be something of a savior. In fact, even more so after that. And my becoming a priest was perhaps a way to make that happen. And then I ran into a wall. Somehow, somewhere, I didn't have a vocational crisis. I knew I wanted to be a priest, but I had an identity crisis, and which led me to my own form of depression. And it led me to a point where I needed to seriously look at where I was going in my life and kind of reclaim my identity. And so I was given permission by our bishop at the time to allow me a moment for serious recovery. And I went, I was on a leave of absence for a period of almost a year. And I addressed a whole host of things, including with my spiritual director and counselor. And I basically came to a moment after a period of a year that I needed to reclaim my identity. And I did that by really ultimately running into God once again through deep prayer, spiritual direction, and reclaiming the reality that I was a son of God and redeemed by Christ. And that was a very important piece for me. And shortly after, I found myself back into the role of a priest and was happy being a parish priest, and maintained all of those elements that were very healthy for me. But what I wanted to share here was to simply say that suicide affects all different fabrics of life. It can affect parents who lose their children. In the case of Ed, Ed lost his daughter. It can affect a sibling. It can affect family and co-workers. It can affect people in the parish life. It can affect deep friendships. It really does affect us all. And we should never take this for granted that, it'll affect one person over another. I remember there was a director for it's called the Survivors of Suicide Loss here in San Diego, and she lost her husband. And by losing her husband, that was traumatic, it was horrible, and she set in motion this Survivors of Suicide Loss. But she was confronted by a wonderful man who had lost his daughter and said to her quite frankly, well, at least you didn't have to undergo the pain that I had to undergo by losing a child. And she wanted to bite her tongue, and she did. But pain is pain. And it doesn't matter if you're a sibling, if you're a child of a parent who dies by suicide, or a parent whose child dies by suicide. Pain is pain. And this handbook is really a response to that reality, that as a church, it is our time to talk about this pain and to accompany those who are suffering through this pain. Next, Ed, if you want to flip through, I think I'm done sharing my own personal story. If you want to get to the next slide. So the Catechism gives us some very simple understandings of our faith. And thankfully, this handbook is compiled by a number of people, including Archbishop Cordileone, who is really a canon lawyer at heart, Archbishop Wilton Gregory. We have Monsignor Steve Rossetti, who helped at the St. Luke's Institute and has counseled a number of priests, some of whom have died by suicide. So we have a whole host of people responding to the Catholic walk or journey with those who are suffering from suicide. And the Catechism is a good spot for most people to go to. That in essence, I don't want to go through each of these moments here, and you can read them here, but like 2281 says, suicide contradicts the natural inclination of the human being to preserve and perpetuate his life. Well, that seems like such a no-brainer. But we also understand that suicide is something that happens due to, you can see the underlying sentence there in 2282, that there are grave psychological disturbances, anguish, or grave fear of hardship or suffering or torture can diminish the responsibility of the one committing suicide. And the key there is diminishing the responsibility. It's what we call a lack of culpability. That the act itself, as Archbishop Cordileone will have in his own chapter, the act itself is grave matter. No doubt about it. The church is going to say this is grave matter, but the act itself is not in and of itself sinful. Sin requires the action, of course, but also the intention, as well as the circumstances. And one could say that a person who dies by suicide intends to die, but the circumstances is the key to this reality. If there's a physiological brain disorder, if there is a chemical disorder, or if there are situational disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, all of these are circumstances that need to be weighed as we consider the general gravity of the sin of death through suicide. So we would say that suicide is grave matter. Clearly it is. We wouldn't be speaking about this, neither Deacon nor I would be speaking about this, because it is grave matter. It matters gravely to us. We would love it if our siblings or our children were here among us. But at the same time, we understand, especially now with psychology and psychiatry and brain scanning, MRIs, and all the rest, that not everyone is culpable in the same way that a person might just rationally make a decision, black or white decision. Next, Deacon. So, you know, and here's some of the hard questions that come up as we're accompanying people with who have died by suicide, survivors of those who have died by suicide. A lot of people question where is their son, where is their daughter, where is their brother or sister or their parent, and so it's. The book reviews what we call eschatology, the four last things: death and judgment, and then heaven or hell. And of course, that something that falls within that is the state of purgation. But of course, we understand from our church's perspective that purgation is really kind of the mud room to the gate of to the kingdom of heaven. If you find yourself in the state of purgation, you're in the kingdom of heaven. It's just kind of the mud room. My mom wouldn't allow us to come in the house after we went to the beach until we washed off the sand. So that's just part of the deal. So the idea of eschatology, the idea of the four last things, is something that is addressed in the book. But then we also have in there a piece that comes from the bishops of the state of California. We have 12 dioceses in California, and the bishops wrote a pastoral statement on mental health, generally speaking. It was called Hope and Healing, and they had a particular chapter on suicide, and they basically were talking about God's mercy is beyond measure, and that is something that we can never, ever take for granted. God's mercy is beyond measure. God knows us better than we'll ever know ourselves. And even as we are coming now into this world of the computer age studies of our minds and our brains, and we think we might have a better picture of what causes a person to die by suicide, even still, God knows us better than we will ever know ourselves. And therefore, God's mercy is far greater than we can ever imagine. And I think that was a very important letter, and it was really a nice springboard for further dialogue and further communication in this respect. One of the things that we had to address, and we've heard Deacon kind of touched on it, how certain people will respond differently to suicide. And especially from a pastoral sense, which is really the purpose of this book. It's a handbook for pastors and people in bereavement ministry and deacons and so on. Often there are different responses. One of the responses, they're all, they can be very powerful and very helpful, especially through prayer and accompaniment. But often there are what I call 3 points of judgment. One is judging the person, being overly judgmental of the person who died by suicide, or even of the family. I recall a time when I was at a funeral down in Mexico, and the person had died by suicide, and the parents were chastised by the priest during his homily. Basically, if the parents had come to church on a regular basis, this would never have happened. So can you imagine that? That's definitely not being pastoral. That's definitely not accompanying. So a person can be overly judgmental, a pastor, they can try to find a reason and fix the puzzle. This would not have happened if this happened. The second is to be overly psychological, and which is quite frankly something that we aren't able to do. I'm not going to play armchair psychologist or psychiatrist. I can't. That's beyond my level of expertise. The best I can do is refer people for counseling. And so the temptation is to again, try to fix it, fix that puzzle, and then try to come up with a diagnosis or even a treatment. And that's something that we can't do. Now, the third is trying to be overly spiritual. And this is a piece that I've noticed in other writings where priests or deacons are focused heavily on, well, the devil made them do it, or that maybe the person was possessed. And there's a temptation for us to negate the science of psychology and psychiatry in favor of over spiritualizing something, where we simply say that a person either was possessed or, again, the devil made them do it. That doesn't give honor to our long-standing tradition within the church that both faith and science lead to the same cause, God. And that people who have great faith, I shared with you, my sister Therese went to church every Sunday. She was in a Catholic school, or she taught in a Catholic school. People of great faith can also have mental disorders and suffer from great depression. And it would be like saying a person who has a broken arm must be possessed. A person who has a disordered brain or a broken brain is not necessarily possessed. And that means that we have to start looking. It doesn't mean that they're not oppressed. They can certainly be oppressed, but they're not necessarily possessed. And when priests or deacons lean quickly to that area, that a person, the devil made him do it, it does great disservice to the science of psychology. And it doesn't help the situation. It really doesn't. And so I'm always trying to encourage people to stop looking for the devil in every corner and start looking at first the science, because both lead to God and both should be honored. So find the right balance. That's the key. Deacon, did you want to switch?
Sure. Yeah, we'll just quickly highlight what's in the book about some of the ministries we discussed throughout the book. We talk about the funeral for a person who died by suicide. I mentioned that earlier, that the funeral might not be the best time to talk about it. The funeral's to rejoice in the hope of Christ and an eternal life. But to work discussion of mental illness and suicide into the general care of the parish community throughout the church year. One of the things that's in the book, and I think is very comforting to people that have lost someone to suicide, is a prayer rite that can be used at the location of a suicide. That might be a difficult thing for people to do, but so often, if the suicide took place in the home or someplace in the backyard, it would be very healing to come and pray at that site, because wherever someone dies, that's a sacred grounds, a holy ground where they've taken into the loving arms of Christ, and whatever pain and suffering that was brought with them to that moment where they died by suicide, Christ welcomed them and held them in their arms as they were suffering this pain. So there is a prayer right there that was developed by Father Charles Ruby out of Chicago, who's been doing a ministry for people that have lost someone to suicide, loving outreach to suicide survivors, LOSS, loss. He's been doing it for many years, and it's a great ministry. Grief support after a suicide, overcoming the isolation and shame. So often those of us who have lost someone to suicide feel isolated and shamed because of it. And there's also chapters in the book that talk about how to minister to youth groups, both prevention and postvention, as it's called, after a suicide occurred, to help the children and young people understand this. And one of the big things that we really shown an initiative in, and we're very encouraged is for parishes to start mental health ministries. A mental health ministry should be, in my view, as common as grief support, prison ministry, youth ministry, any other ministry that we could minister to people that are living with mental health challenges, mental illnesses, and ministering to people that have lost someone to suicide. So I and Bishop Dolan and a number of people around the country have banded together to form a network that we call the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers. And I would encourage you to go to the web page and take a look at it. sign up to be a member, start a chapter. We're also offering grants to parishes and dioceses that might want to start a mental health ministry in their area. We at least want to take money off the table as a reason not to start this ministry. So please take a look at the page. And if you think that's something you would be interested in, like I said, there are grants and financial support to help with this type of ministry. So I'll leave it to you, Bishop. I see our time's moving along pretty quick here for some closing thoughts. These are some questions, and I think we wanted to leave a few minutes for questions from the group, the attendees.
Yeah, so you see some of those questions right there, and I'm sure you can take a look at those, and can pop back in, and maybe she can tell us if there are any questions out there for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bishop and Deacon, for sharing your stories and what you've learned from your experiences. I've gotten a lot of questions here from people regarding how they can purchase your book. So we're going to talk about that at the end. Don't worry at all. A couple of things that come to mind. First of all, I'm getting a lot of responses here. Thank you for sharing your story. This was excellent. One woman, Hannah, says that, how would you help a friend who you think is depressed, is using some language maybe that is leaning towards this person having suicidal thoughts? What would be your suggestion for her to help her friend?
Deacon?
Well, yeah, I mean, I get that a lot now. And the first question, I would not be reluctant. Don't hesitate at all. Ask them if they are thinking of hurting themselves or if they're having suicidal thoughts. Ask them that directly. Are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? You're not going to put that idea in their mind. You're not going to put that idea in anybody's mind. You're not going to jeopardize it. And then depending on what the answer is, you can take the appropriate action. Clearly, if they said, yes, I have a plan, I have a gun in my hands, I'm going to shoot myself, you would call 911 and get them immediate help. But there might be some answers intermediate to that where you would encourage them to get support through professional support through a psychiatrist and psychologist. But I would say the first thing is just ask them directly. And also in your community, I would say keep your ears open. There's a thing called mental health first aid, which is a good basic program, 8 hours on how to talk about mental illness and how to talk to people that are living with a mental illness.
And I would say, just adding on to that, I think if you are in a parish, ask your pastor if he has some counselors available, people at his fingertips. You know, usually people have a Rolodex of names, and so that's an important thing, so that they can be referred to the counselors.
Yes, thank you. Mary Pat asks a question about mental health ministries in parishes. You know, I think so many of us think about there's youth ministry and there's bereavement ministry or there's whatever, but we don't necessarily, how many parishes is the question that have mental health ministries?
Well, we started that in San Diego. We had our own mental health ministry here in San Diego, and it became something of a model for other parishes and dioceses. And what we came to see is that mental health ministry has different ways. There are different ways of looking at it. Some can be strictly information-based, advocacy-based. Some are actual sit down in a group, and we're going to talk about the various mental healths that we have, our mental wellnesses, and those are they come in different sizes and forms. Not every parish can sustain a mental health ministry. Some aren't as large, but a lot of parishes can couple up.
Yeah, and again, I would encourage you to go to that webpage that I showed at the end of the presentation, the Catholic Association of Mental Health Ministers. The short answer is not nearly enough parishes and dioceses have a mental health ministry at this point. So that's why we formed this network and are offering grants and support to build up that ministry.
That's wonderful. So, Bishop, you mentioned that you had heard a homily at a funeral in which the priest chastised the family. My children, one of their closest friends, died by suicide right before my daughter was going to college, and I can remember holding my breath when walking into that church and just praying that the priest spoke, in a pastoral way during the homily. What could someone do if they find themselves in a situation in which the homily was, let me just use the word, inappropriate for the circumstance?
Well, I would say, just a couple Sundays ago, we had that opportunity laid before us. Jesus says, go to the person first, right? And if not, then find somebody else acting as a mediator who can talk. So if the pastor says something or the deacon says something that's inappropriate, go to that pastor, go to that deacon, say, that really hurt my feelings. And let that pastor know it, because they may not see that. They may not know it. They may be very objective on this reality. So just talk to them, let them know that. That's the first. And then the second is, to honor the gospel is to then maybe bring a second person into that conversation. And the third is maybe hopefully it doesn't come to this, is then, maybe refer that to the bishop or his authority. But generally, we try to avoid that. I'm on the receiving end of some of that. And often that happens where a person will come to me first, rather than going to the person, the priest.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a very smart response, a very smart answer for sure. I have a question here from a person who's a hospital chaplain. How can I best help families in the ER after a suicide of a loved one?
I don't know how you feel about this, Deacon Ed, but the tragedy, that every emotion comes out, and anger is one of them. And of course, we know those stages of death affect the people who are survivors of suicide loss, which includes denial. I mean, there could be great denial that this happened, and then anger, and then bargaining, and then there's a whole host of stuff that happens within the first 5, 10, 15 minutes. So in an ER situation, whoever is asking that question, my heart goes out to you, because that is not an easy thing. The best to do is to accompany with a form of prayer and just listen. Just listen. It's probably, especially in the first half hour, it's probably not a time to give any kind of advice or even suggestion, but just to listen.
I would second that. Any sudden death, but particularly suicide, there's nothing you can say to make it better. There's absolutely nothing you can say. You can hold them and hope and pray that the Holy Spirit envelope both you and the grieving person to bring some level of comfort. But there are no magic words, and sometimes it's better not to say anything. It's better just to hold them and be with them, and pray for the presence of Christ to be with them in the midst of this sorrow. They're in a state of shock.
Yes, for sure. What would you, I know our time is running out, but what would each of you share or impress upon ministers, right, working in the parish, who come across families who are dealing with guilt, anger? What is the best way for them to care for these individuals, these families?
My initial thing would be to listen. Listen. We are going through right now this issue on racism in the church, and one of the things that we're doing is not jumping in with our own thoughts, our pre-conditioned thoughts about what racism may be or it may not be. We're listening to people within the African American community, just listening to their story. Let them tell us what racism is for them. And the same thing is true for anyone who is suffering from the suicide loss. Just listen before you even make any comment. And that may take days, weeks. Just, we want to hear, how are things going? Just how are things going? Just tell me.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things Bishop and I did was there's a follow-up book after this pastoral book, to address that situation directly. It's when a loved one dies by suicide. And it's a smaller book. I know after Katie died, you couldn't read a lot, but I could read short things. So this is a short book that relates our stories and offers a series of prayers so that people can just sit with the loss, sit with the suicide, sit in the presence of Christ and pray about it. So our hope is this follow-up book would be something that someone could take and slowly read over a period of days, maybe even over a period of weeks, like pray a novena with it and pray on this suicide and ask Christ to come into their life.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Deacon, would you share with us the website that you mentioned?
The Catholic Mental Health Ministers?
Yes.
Yeah, it's CatholicMHM.org. Catholic Mental Health Ministers.
CatholicMentalHealthMinisters.org.
Yeah, so Catholic and then MHM. Catholic MHM.
CatholicMHM.org. Okay, wonderful. Got a lot of requests for you to repeat that one more time. So one of the reasons why we wanted to do this webinar this month is because September is Suicide Awareness Month. But the books will not be out actually until November. So we are encouraging you to pre-order today, and we're going to offer you 25% off these books. The handbook is the Responding to Suicide one that they have been speaking about in this webinar. When a loved one dies by suicide, that then is the book that you can give to a grieving family, friend, individual to help them through this. And so those are the two different books. You've definitely left us, I think, yearning for more, and definitely knowing the reality and the importance of how this can help us in our ministry and can help others. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your story, for sharing this with us today. For those of you who want to pre-order, you can go to AveMariaPress.com and you want to use this promo code webinar0915, and that's of course for today's date. And this promotion or this offer expires on the 25th of this month. So we encourage you to take advantage of that. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending you an email tomorrow with the link to the recording, and all of our past webinar recordings can be found on our website at AveMariaPress.com. I invite you to join us next week, in which we're going to be talking about how we can help volunteers walk with our young people today. Bishop, you mentioned accompanying several times, and so this too is important. Paul Cifuentes is Director of Youth Ministry in Indianapolis, and Jake Tietgen also is a youth minister in that area. So 30 years of experience. They want to share with us that it's about people, not programs. So please join us for that. Once again, thank you so much to everybody who have been with us this hour, and thank you, Deacon and Bishop. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Erin.
Bye-bye. Thank you.